who kindly agreed to speak on a very contemporary issue, that COVID-19, and how what should be the development paradigm after this COVID-19. But I should tell that I requested Professor Pulin Naik to invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and Professor Prabhat Patnaik also readily accepted our invitation, and he agreed to speak on this issue. And uh, so we have with us the President of Odisha Economics Association, Professor Bhavesh Sen, and then we have so many members of the Odisha Economic Association, as well as there are also members who are joining from outside this association. And so I should tell you that only a few weeks ago we had another webinar in which we discussed in details about the report that is prepared by the Odisha Economics Association, that is COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 on the Odisha economy, challenges, and the way forward. And so this will be the second webinar during this COVID-19, and so now Odisha Economics Association has about 670 life members, and now we are taking up different activities basically so that our young researchers and the academic community in Odisha benefit out of this intellectual discussion. So I will not take much time because I have informed Professor Pulin Naik will be basically moderating this session. But I'll just briefly introduce Professor Prabhat Patnaik, although Professor Prabhat Patnaik does not need any introduction to this audience. But actually, I should tell the people who are maybe there are some students who have joined in this webinar. So Professor Prabhat Patnaik is basically from Odisha and Jatni, and then he studied in the Dali College, Indore, on a Government of India merit scholarship, and he completed his BA with economics honors from the St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and he went to Oxford, University of Oxford, for obtaining his PhD on Rhodes scholarship, and then he joined University of Cambridge in 1969, and then he was elected as a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. And then in 1974, he returned to India as an associate professor at the newly established Center for Economic Studies and Planning, CESP, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And he became a professor in 1983 and taught there till his retirement. And towards the end of his career, he was holding the Sukhumvir Chakrabarti chair in planning and development at CSP. And Professor Patnaik was also the vice chairman of Kerala State Planning Board from June 2006 to May 2011, and he was a part of a four-member high-power task force of the United Nations to recommend reform measures for the global financial system, chaired by Professor Joseph Stiglitz. And that will be a very brief introduction, and we know that he has a number of publications, and so I don't have to speak about that. So with this very brief introduction, I will now invite Professor Pulin Naik to moderate the session, and welcome Professor Prabhat Patnaik to speak on the theme that he has already given to us. So over to Professor Pulin Naik.
Okay. Thank you, Amarendra. Am I audible, Amarendra? Am I
yes,
audible?
Sir, yes, sir.
Yes. A very warm welcome to everyone, and especially to Prabhat Babu, who is the main speaker for the day. Friends, I have had the privilege of having known Professor Prabhat Patnaik for a long time. Prabhat Patnaik is born in Jatni, and our house is hardly 10 minutes walk from Prabhat Patnaik's, that is his father's, Pranath Patnaik's earlier house, which is hardly 10 minutes from our place. They have, of course, left Jatni. They went to Bhubaneswar, and Prabhat's younger brother, Pradosh, was my classmate in Jatni High School. Pradosh and I, we were together studying in classes 6 and 7. So I've known Prabhat for a very, very long time. We are extremely fortunate in being able to persuade Prabhat. He is a very busy person, very busy intellectual, economist, of course. And when Amarendra asked me as to whether Prabhat Babu would agree to speak to the Odisha Economic Association, I was pretty sure that he will come forward and say yes. And within a few hours of my sending an email to him, he agreed, and here he is. So we're extremely fortunate in having Prabhat Babu. So without losing any further time, Prabhat is going to speak on a strategy for post-pandemic development. This is the topic. So this is a wonderful opportunity. So Prabhat, a very warm welcome to you. I mean, you have been a past president of the Odisha Economic Association, so you are no stranger to this particular body. So a warm welcome to you, and please now give us your talk. So please feel free to order it any which way you like, but possibly you could speak for about, say, half an hour or so. And this is 5:10 right now, so till about 5:40. And after that, maybe we can have questions for about 20 minutes, and that's all. That'll be the end of the session. So if this is okay, we can start. So, Prabhat.
Sir, you have to unmute yourself. Sir, you have to
Ha,
unmute.
Prabhat, you have to unmute, yes.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
yes, Prabhat.
Yeah, all right.
Yes.
Thank you very much for having me at this webinar. I have, of course, been closely associated with the Odisha Economic Association for a very long time. I was a president long ago, and what is more, I am a life member of the Odisha Economic Association. I thought that before I get on to speaking something about exactly what the nature of post-pandemic development strategy should be, I should say something about the pre-pandemic world, including pre-pandemic India. You see, obviously the pandemic has produced a massive crisis, particularly the lockdown associated with the pandemic has produced a massive crisis. You actually have had absolute reductions in GDP, you have had huge unemployment and so on. But even before the pandemic began, the world economy and with it the Indian economy was actually moving into a fairly serious crisis. As you know, before the pandemic began, the chronic unemployment rate in India, chronic unemployment normally is quite small. The chronic unemployment rate in India was about 6%, which is higher than at any time in the last 45 years. I say 45 years because you have, at the time of the first oil shock, there was obviously a contraction of the economy, partly a policy induced, at which point of time there was a higher unemployment rate. But since then, there had never been a period in which you had such high unemployment rate. If you look even at the per capita real consumption expenditure, data for which was suppressed by the government, but it was actually discussed in the press, you find that per capita real consumption expenditure in 2017-18, according to the NSS, was 9% lower in rural India than it had been in 2011-12. As you know, these are years of quinquennial NSS large sample surveys, and so you can compare them and you find that there was a 9% drop in per capita real expenditure, which is a huge drop. So the point is that already before the pandemic began, there was a crisis that was engulfing the Indian economy. But this crisis, in turn, was part of a global economic crisis. In fact, you look at the world economy as a whole, there was likewise a crisis, and India, being linked to the world economy, was actually facing the effect of that crisis. There are numerous kind of figures one can give. The level of unemployment was very high all over Europe. In America, the level of unemployment or the unemployment rate was low, but that is because there is a very sharp drop in the participation rate compared to 2008. In other words, in America, after the financial crisis of 2008, unemployment has been high, but because of the drop in the participation rate of because the drop in the workforce participation rate, the unemployment rate appears small, which is why Trump said that in America we have never had such low unemployment. But if you adjust for the drop in participation rate, the unemployment rate even in the US is very high. There's a huge unutilized capacity, and what is more, after 2011, there's a very sharp drop in primary commodity prices. As a matter of fact, between 2011, April 2011, and December 2019, before the pandemic began, there was a 38% drop in absolute terms in the index of commodity prices, which is produced by the IMF. So there's a world crisis, and India is linked to that. Now, of course, one of the questions which would arise is, why is there a world crisis? How come that there is a world crisis like this? I believe it is linked very closely to the nature of the neoliberal economy. I think we should have some discussion on the nature of the neoliberal economy. I think one of the main features of the neoliberal economy is the free global flow of capital, including finance, because of which we now are in a world in which finance is globalized. Globalized finance is facing nation states. Well, this is a very peculiar situation. You see, when Keynes was talking about demand management, Keynes was very clear that it is very important that finance be national. Because if you have globalized finance, but the state is a nation state, then the ability of the nation state to pursue any economic policies that it may wish to pursue is limited, because if finance doesn't like that economic policy, they'll just quit the country. Because of which Keynes had said finance above all must be national in an article he wrote in a journal called Yale Review in 1933. And the point is that therefore we are now in a world in which we have globalization of finance, but nation states, because of which nation states, whether they like it or not, have more or less got to pursue the same kinds of economic policies. No matter which government you get, they more or less pursue the same economic policies, maybe with greater or lesser vigor. But what is more, these policies are the ones which are liked by finance, because this is called keeping up the confidence of the investors. Confidence of the investors basically means pursuing policies which are liked by finance, because if you did not, then they would leave your country. Now, this has a number of implications. Let me just very briefly touch upon them, because I think it's quite important. You have globalization of finance, but also of capital. You have American multinationals now investing in China, in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, everywhere. They do that because the wages are lower in these countries. As a matter of fact, that links the wages of the American workforce to the wages of the Chinese, of the Vietnamese, and so on. In America, the trade union movement is very badly damaged, because if they demand higher wages, then the enterprises decide to shift out of America into Indonesia or into Vietnam or into China. Because of this now, you find that the real wages, even in the advanced capitalist countries, get linked. I'm not saying they get equalized. They simply get linked to the real wages which prevail in the underdeveloped countries. Now, in the underdeveloped countries, there are huge labor reserves, because of which the real wages, as we know, are pretty close to the subsistence level. Because of that, in America too, or in Britain, or in Europe, the real wages, because they get linked to the third world labor reserves, don't rise. As a matter of fact, Stiglitz made a calculation that if you look at the average real wage of a male American worker in 1968 and in 2011, real wage, then you find that in 2011 it was marginally lower than in 1968. And that's true of American workers. So you find that all over the world, the vector of real wages don't rise. The vector of real wages, I'm not saying they get equalized, but the vector of real wages does not rise over time, even as labor productivity is rising everywhere. Because of which you find that the share of wages in output falls, the share of non-wage incomes, the surplus incomes rises in total output, and we know that any a reduction in the share of wages, or if you like, a shift from wages to surplus, or a shift from wages to profits, is something which is associated with a reduction in the level of consumption. Because if you give a rupee to a working person, that person is likely to consume the whole rupee or much of it. While if you give a rupee to some very rich man, that person would actually consume, let's say, 50 paise and keep the remaining to be spent later, which is what we call savings. Therefore, what you find is that this increase in inequality, which is immanent in this entire uh, globalization phenomenon, gives rise to a tendency towards overproduction, because consumption is something that actually receives a setback because of this rise in income inequality. It's a well-known proposition in macroeconomics. I don't need to label it. It's pretty obvious. And of course, if consumption does not rise, then investment, since investment looks at whether the markets are growing or not before actually being undertaken, before investment is actually undertaken, investment doesn't rise. You have a slowing down of the rate of growth of the economy, you have a slowing down of the level of activity, and so on. This, of course, is what economists would call an ex ante tendency. In other words, the tendency against which sometimes you can have offsetting tendencies. Now, throughout the 90s and the earlier part of this century, there was an offsetting tendency, and that was in the form of asset price bubbles. In the 1990s, you had the dot-com bubble in the United States. Earlier this century, at the housing bubble in the United States, the moment the dot-com bubble collapsed, the chairman of the American Central Bank at that time, Alan Greenspan, reduced interest rates, and that actually stimulated the housing bubble, which, as we know, collapsed in 2008, after which the world economy has been, as I mentioned, in a sort of protracted crisis. So the point is that the bubbles, what does the bubble do? The bubble artificially raises the prices of an asset well beyond what its true value is. Okay. And as a result, a lot of people feel rich, so they begin to spend more. And what is more, if it's a financial asset whose price has just shot up, then you find that borrowing becomes cheap. And if borrowing becomes cheap, then many people borrow in order to spend. Even investment might get picked up if borrowing is so dirt cheap. Therefore, a bubble of that kind is something that can act as a stimulus to demand, and this is what was happening earlier. Now, the bubbles no longer work. I mean, you can't order a bubble. Efforts have been made by the US monetary policy. As you know, the US is the largest economy. What happens to the US economy affects the entire world economy. And therefore, in the US, monetary policy has actually been very active in trying to promote a bubble. As you know, earlier the interest rate was actually pushed down to close to zero. Again, now there's an effort to push down, then interest rates came up, then now again there's an effort to push down interest rates close to zero. And when you push down interest rates close to zero, it's not necessarily that you actually expect, as we know in textbook economics, that with the interest rates low, there'll be more investment and so on. But really, when interest rates are pushed down, the expectation is that they would give rise to a bubble in asset prices. And if they give rise to a bubble in asset prices, then that is going to stimulate demand, and investment is going to respond to that. Now, this is something which was working before, has not been working now. And this is basically the reason why the world economy has actually slowed down. To recapitulate, the increase in inequality, the rise in the share of surplus relative to wages, together with the fact that state investment is something which is out because finance does not like an activist state, and we have globalized finance facing the nation state, because of which the nation state can't be too active in fiscal policy. As you know, all over the world, there's fiscal responsibility legislation, except in the US, because of which the governments are all, their hands are tied. They cannot enlarge the fiscal deficit. They cannot even tax the capitalists, because that too is going to affect the confidence of the investors, and therefore you would have an outflow of finance. For all these reasons, the states cannot intervene through fiscal policy. Through monetary policy, they have been intervening in order to cause bubbles, but that is something you can't order. And as a result, the world economy is something which has slowed down. And this is something which makes itself felt even at the level of the Indian economy. Now, this is not just something I am saying. Okay, I've given you the links in the chain of the argument, but the fact that neoliberal capitalism has reached a kind of dead end is something which is now pretty well recognized among, shall we say, the more discerning among the financial writers. The London Financial Times has been having editorials one after another, and mind you, that's a very, very posh financial newspaper, saying that, look, we have to go beyond the policies of the last 4 decades, meaning thereby the policies of neoliberalism associated with globalization. The other day, the British Prime Minister, no less, Boris Johnson, actually made a speech in which he said that, look, we have to start a new deal. In other words, the fact that we are now in a moment in history which is comparable to the 1930s in the US, when there was a New Deal, which was, if you like, a moment in history which one can call a sort of Keynes Roosevelt moment, the kind of moment in which state intervention becomes essential in order to bring capitalism out of a crisis, which is what Roosevelt had tried to do in 1936 with the New Deal, which is what Keynes advocated, and so on. Now, this is something which now Boris Johnson himself is talking about a New Deal. As I said, financial writers have been talking about the fact that the policies of the last 4 decades have to be changed. The state has to intervene much more. Boris Johnson actually talked about public investment. Imagine, in our country, there's so much against the public sector, but here is the conservative Prime Minister of Britain talking about public investment. Now, it seems to me, therefore, that when we come out of this pandemic, it's not as if we are going to be back to some normal situation. That when we come out of this pandemic, whenever we do, I don't know when, but whenever we come out of this pandemic, we have to think in terms of an alternative strategy of development, without which we would be once more, although we would have overcome the immediate crisis associated with the pandemic, we wouldn't have overcome the long-term crisis that world capitalism and along with it the Indian economy have got into. Therefore, I think if neoliberalism has reached a dead end, then it is very important for us to think in terms of an alternative uh, strategy of development and an alternative way that the economy can actually be revived. Now, obviously, the broad contours of this alternative in India should be pretty clear. One of them would be that, look, this whole idea of external market as being a stimulus for growth is something which now is not going to work, and therefore we have to have a development of the home market. The moment you have a development of the home market depends essentially on the level of agricultural growth rate. If agricultural growth rate, among other things, a major determinant is the rate of growth of the agricultural sector. If you have a high rate of agricultural growth rate, then for that you need a substantial government support uh, for the agricultural sector. You see, one of the things which has occurred over the last several years during this entire period of neoliberal economic policies is the neglect of agriculture. Now, this is something which often does not get captured. If you look at terms of trade data in India, you'd say, Arey, because the terms of trade have not moved against agriculture. So how can you say that agricultural sector has been discriminated against, which I'm saying? I'll give you a very simple example. When I returned from Cambridge to join the JNU, I joined as an associate professor, as Amarendra Babu said, and our basic salary at that time was 700 rupees per month. Today, I believe the basic salary of an associate professor would be about 50,000 rupees a month. That means, let us say, 70 times what it was at that time. When I joined, the procurement price of a quintal of wheat, let us say, was 75 rupees. Today, the procurement price of a quintal of wheat would be just over 1,500 rupees. So 20 times. Therefore, you look at it in relative terms. In relative terms, the salary of a professor today is 3.5 times the income of a peasant compared to 1973 as the base year. So the point is that, why is that the case? I mean, after all, it's not even, and it's not even. So obviously, the procurement prices have not really kept pace with the income increases elsewhere. But what is more, you also find that even though the terms of trade between agriculture and industry may not be actually working against agriculture, you look at the cost of living of the peasants. The cost of living of the peasants has gone up a lot more. And that's partly because of the privatization of essential services like education, healthcare, and so on. There are lots of stories you must have come across, whether in Odisha, in Delhi, there are lots of stories that peasants, suppose a child falls ill in Western Uttar Pradesh. The peasants bring the child to Delhi, and of course, they take the child. If there is no room in the government hospitals, they take the child to the private hospital. After about a fortnight or so, the private hospital says that, look, sorry, you have to give more money, and they give lakhs of rupees. They sell land to come and give lakhs of rupees, at which point the hospital says, okay, this meets the earlier bill, but sorry, you have to leave now because now again the bill is going to pile up. And there was a horrendous story about a child who died at the end of it, so that actually the peasants completely lost all their assets and the child died and so on. So there are lots of such stories. Now the point is that public health care has progressively been withdrawn. Public education has progressively been run down. Therefore, the privatization of essential services increases, and this is only one of the factors, increases greatly the cost of living as far as ordinary people, peasants, and working people are concerned. And that's one reason. So obviously, for all these reasons, it is the case that till now, the agricultural sector in this entire period has been very badly dealt with. If you therefore are thinking in terms of agriculture being revived as a means to increasing the size of the home market, then this has to be undone. You have to have private provisioning of essential services. By the way, this is again something which the London Financial Times is demanding as far as the British economy is concerned. Private provisioning of public services, public investment in rural areas, including of agriculture. Now, the moment you think of this, obviously this is not going to be liked by globalized finance. I said earlier that when globalized finance faces the nation state's hands are tied. If you want to untie those hands, if you want to make sure that the nation state can actually do all these things that I'm suggesting, then of course you'd find that there will be a capital flight, there would be a massive outflow of finance. Therefore, you would have to have capital controls. Capital controls would become essential for the state to actually acquire the autonomy to pursue any alternative economic strategy. When you have capital flight and if you have capital controls, then it will be difficult for you to meet your current account deficit on the balance of payments, because as you know, we have been having perpetual current account deficits, and we meet those deficits essentially through the flow of finance. So if you have some kind of capital flight, then you wouldn't be able to meet your current account deficit, and this in turn would really require you to have some kind of trade controls as well. Therefore, the regime of economic policy that we have to set up in the coming days after the pandemic is over, if we wish to overcome this situation of unemployment, unutilized capacity, declining consumption in rural areas, and so on, is one that would necessarily entail capital controls, and that will controls on financial outflows, and therefore some degree of trade controls as well. How would the government finance larger public investment? How would it finance larger provisioning of public services? Obvious way for it to finance is, of course, through a larger fiscal deficit. But better than a larger fiscal deficit, and why better I'll discuss in a moment, it would be uh, wealth taxation, taxing wealth. Now, in India, we have absolutely almost zero wealth taxation. People like Thomas Piketty and so on have been arguing for a very long time that look, wealth inequalities are becoming bad. We must have wealth taxation. But on the other hand, this is something which in India we have virtually abandoned. And if you are going to really finance public expenditure, public investment, then one very obvious way of doing it is through a wealth taxation. I'll just end by giving a few illustrative figures. You see, once I made a calculation that suppose for every Indian citizen, so far I've been talking about the strategy of development. Now I'm approaching that question from a different point of view. Suppose for every Indian citizen, we want to provide 5 universal basic economic rights. Just as we have political rights, suppose we want to provide 5 basic, universal, justiciable economic rights that the citizen can take the government to court if these rights are not being met. Those 5 rights would be right to food, right to quality, free, publicly provided health care through a national health service, right to quality, free, publicly provided education, at least up to the higher secondary level, right to old age pensions and disability benefits, and right to employment, failing which the person should be paid a wage. In other words, it is the job of the state to provide employment to everybody. If a person remains unemployed, in that case, the state should provide him a wage nonetheless. If you want to institute these 5 rights, over and above what you're currently spending on many of these heads, you need to spend about 10% extra of your GDP. Now, in order to spend 10% extra of your GDP, a theorem of the multiplier tells you that you really have to raise 7% extra of your GDP in the form of revenue. Because as you start spending, some of it comes back to you. It generates incomes. Some of it comes back to you as additional taxes. So if you take that out, in that case, you need to mobilize a fresh 7% of your GDP. Now, it turns out that if you impose 2% wealth tax on the top 1% of the population, number one. And number two, you cannot impose a wealth tax without at the same time imposing an inheritance tax, because then people would simply divide up their wealth among their children and progeny and so on. So a 2% wealth tax and an inheritance tax of one third on the amount that is being handed over every year. I assume that 5% of wealth every year of the top 1%, I'm not talking about anybody else, of the top 1% of the population, suppose every year 5% of the wealth is just distributed, okay, because someone dies and so on. You take one third of that as an inheritance tax. These two alone would be able to meet your entire 7% of GDP that you need to raise in order to finance the five basic economic universal rights. Now, I just want to say one or two things about inheritance taxation. Wealth taxation is obvious. Everybody, by the way, in advanced capitalist countries, you have very heavy wealth taxation. You also have very heavy inheritance taxation. Apparently, in Japan, for instance, when a person dies, 80% of that person's wealth is taken away in the form of death duty. Now, there is a philosophy behind it. The philosophy is that, look, capitalism, mind you, this is not a socialist project. This is, in fact, a bourgeois capitalist project. Capitalism's theory is that, look, I acquire wealth because I have a talent. I have the capacity to innovate. I have the capacity maybe to take risks and so on. There is some special quality that a capitalist or an entrepreneur has, some special quality because of which the entrepreneur earns that wealth. Let us accept that. But the fact that the special quality of the entrepreneur has to be demonstrated as far as the children of the original person is concerned is something that has to be demonstrated. So the idea of having wealth, or the justification of wealth that you find in standard bourgeois economics is a justification that cannot justify inheritance. And as a result, inheritance taxation in India, we just don't have. And of course, we don't even have wealth taxation. You just have these two things, and that would be quite enough to provide you with a set of five basic economic rights. But of course, the two sides which I have been discussing, one is that having, let's say, expansion of the home market and so on, the other from the side of rights, they're actually part of the same story. Suppose you actually had these rights, then of course you can't say right to food unless you have enough food. Therefore, that would require you to change your development strategy in the kind of direction which I'm talking about. So fundamentally, it seems to me that when we come out of this COVID-19, then the country would have to take a different turn as far as the economic strategy is concerned. Otherwise, we are going to be mired in this crisis, in unemployment and so on. Let me very briefly, in 2-3 minutes, discuss what the government has been doing. What the government has been doing is that it has been proceeding on the assumption that, look, neoliberalism, the Indian government, that neoliberalism is basically the regime in which we are going to stay. And within this, the idea is to attract larger amounts of investment, make in India, or, corporate tax rebates, making labor laws more anti-labor. So the idea is that you actually provide, if you like, incentives to the capitalists to undertake investment, and you proceed on the assumption that giving them tax rebates or making labor laws more anti-labor is going to provide them with incentives. I mean, workers can be hired and fired at will. In that case, it will make the capitalists more confident to undertake investments. As a matter of fact, it is completely counterproductive. If you give corporate tax rebates, But on the other hand, you are tied by fiscal responsibility legislation, so that if you give away 1.5 lakh crores, then somewhere the government feels compelled to reduce its expenditure by 1.5 lakh crores because of the fact that otherwise the fiscal deficit is going to be larger. Then you find that the 1.5 lakh crores which is given to the capitalists, they don't spend all of it. Okay, they may, let's say, spend part of it, but the 1.5 lakh crores the government reduces its expenditure by, all of it is a reduction in demand. Therefore, there is a net reduction in demand that is involved in the government giving corporate taxation, corporate tax rebates, which is therefore counterproductive. It actually increases unemployment and unutilized capacity, reduces investment, and therefore that's no way of tackling the crisis. Likewise, making labor laws more stringent against the workers essentially means that there is a further shift from wages to profits, and that is something which, as I've already said, tends to be counterproductive. So, if we are not going to keep flogging the dead horse of neoliberalism at a time when it has actually reached a dead end, then it becomes imperative for us to think in terms of an alternative. And that alternative would have to mean greater government intervention and a greater reliance on the home market. And of course, if you have wealth taxation and so on, that's a way of ensuring that your income inequalities at least don't increase, or wealth inequalities at least don't increase, even if they may not actually decrease. Okay? I better stop there.
You, Prabhat, for that wonderful exposition. And I think it has been a fantastic exposition. And before we take the questions, I'll just touch on two or three of the key points that Prabhat Patnaik mentioned in his beautifully constructed statement and assessment of the Indian economy right now. The key points in the way I understood it is the fact that the government has a very low presence in the health sector, and who can sort of dispute this point? And India's situation on health has been one of the most, I would say, even use the word, it's a shameful situation that the Indian government has in the area of health. Public expenditure as a fraction of GDP in the health sector is a bare 1.2 or 1.3% right now. It was under 1% for long years. Very recently, it moved up very slowly to about 1.2, 1.3%. It's a pittance amount. If you look at equivalent numbers elsewhere, China has a figure of greater than 3%. If you look at Western European countries, the figure is more in the range of about 8 to 10%. Now, I'm not saying that India should tomorrow have an 8% public expenditure on health as a fraction of GDP. That cannot be done, but certainly in the range of something like 3 to 4%. When you look at the COVID, very recent pandemic and the difficulties we have gone through, where are the people getting the health care? For all the major emphasis that we've put on private health, onto those big, very high-flying private hospitals, in Apollo and so forth and so on, in various cities of the country, Delhi, Bombay, even Bhubaneswar and so forth, where the common man has to spend huge amounts per day. Prabhat was already mentioning some stories of a young child going to a private hospital and the family getting completely sort of impoverished because of a brief ailment where your child goes to a private hospital. So what we need is public expenditure on health, and this has to be financed by the state. And asking for a figure something like 3 to 4% in the immediate run is not out of the way. That is number one. Education, again, over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a clear manner in which the government has been withdrawing from public expenditure on education. What we have been doing is a lot of mushrooming of private engineering colleges, management institutions, and so forth and so on, which are very poorly run, very poor quality of faculty, and so forth. Liberal education, in the manner that the Indian education system started out post-independence, it went up to a particular point in time, say about the late 80s or something like that. But after that, there's been a move towards the government withdrawing. I understand that even in the economics department of Utkal University in Bhubaneswar, there used to be, apparently, somebody told me, a member of the faculty in Bhubaneswar told me that there used to be 17 permanent positions, professor, reader, and lecturer, so basically 17 position thila. Bortaman, there are only 3 positions, only three. And for the remaining papers on public finance, international trade, and so forth and so on, they get guest lecturers from Bhubaneswar, Kotakuru, someone guest lecturer, Aniki, they give some amount and they try to fulfill the requirements of the teaching. Now, that is not the way you want to run your public universities. Rather than strengthening them, we are withdrawing emphasis. So that was the second major point. Of course, Prabhat mentions the 5 major, the right to food is a very critical component of the 5 requirements that he very correctly mentions, and I totally agree. The key point here is the issue of raising additional revenues towards spending on the bottom sections of the population. Now, it is absolutely clear that over the past 20 to 30 years, if you look at public expenditure on investment in the rural sector, that has been going down. If you look at public investment in the rural sector of the Indian economy, that has been going down. So there is impoverishment in the rural economy as a whole. You know, national income in the rural sector in agriculture raises about what, 15-16%, and even today something like 50 to 55 or even 60% of the population is dependent on agriculture, and the earning is barely 15 to 16%. Most of the earning is in the services sector and so forth, concentrated in a very narrow section of the population. So the end result is an increase in inequality, which Prabhat very correctly touches upon. And one of the key ways of tackling this is to bring in wealth taxation. We've never had it. Inheritance tax, we did have estate duty, but we gave it up. We started it again we gave it up. So the end result is Amaro wealth tax nai ki inheritance duty basically nai. We have to bring it back, and Prabhat is very right, and recently Piketty and many others in raising this particular issue, and this is something that really must be done. But I don't want to hog the time. This has been a wonderful presentation, so let's have some questions, and we have 10-15 minutes easily, so please. We'll take, say, 4 or 5 questions or observations. First, Prabhat will answer them or respond to them. And if time permits, another 4 or 5, and so forth. That's how we will go. Is that okay, Amrit?
Yes, sir. There are already a lot of questions in the chat box, and I'm just going to read out some of the questions.
Please, each person, whosoever is asking the question, please be pointed, ask only one question. Not too long, just one question. 4 people will ask questions or make observations. Prabhat will respond. Then we'll go for a second round. Now start, please.
Okay, so I will start I'm taking the questions from the chat box. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So the first question is coming from Mr. Dr. Prabhat Patnaik. What is the role of private sector in responding to COVID-19 pandemic? So, shall I read out all the questions and you would reply to all the questions together?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, 4 questions. Please read, and Prabhat will answer 4.
Okay. And then second question is what austerity measures should be taken by the government to reduce unemployment rate? On which sectors should it be, and how young minds will be employed? Then another question from Mr. Rajesh Mahapatra. 2 weeks ago, we had the first report of an alleged starvation death that is in Nayagarh district of Odisha. Do you foresee hunger returning on a large scale? Yeah, so that is the question from Mr. Rajesh Mahapatra. Then there is another question from Kaiballapatti Mishra. As the neoliberal empire of economics stand on the bedrock of political industrialist nexus, what leads the citizens to ignore their needs and elect the same government for consecutive terms? Then he is referring to the government, of course, both at the center and the state. Then Professor Srijit Mishra, Director, Navakrishna Chaudhary Center for Development Studies. Can states be independently allowed to raise revenue like indirect taxes, like direct taxes? What are the constitutional imperatives? Some recent ordinances in agri reforms have their antecedents in 15th Finance Commission, a requirement to receive grants from the center. Is this constitutionally legitimate?
Okay, let that be.
I think I will stop here, and then I think you can respond to these questions, and then after that we will take up other questions.
Yes. Yeah. Now let Professor Patnaik answer these questions.
Acha, pull in the last two questions I could quite catch. Can you just
last you Srijit asked a question, Amarendra, you repeat that question of Srijit, which was the fourth question, am I right?
Yes. Srijit bhai, will you unmute yourself and speak?
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It was nice listening to you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik. I think the first comes from your wealth taxes and such suggestions. So whether we are largely dependent on the center for those taxes or getting a share of those taxes. Can states be independently allowed to raise revenue as some countries in the Western world do? Because we have a constitutional imperative there. How do we go about it? The other thing is that recent 2 ordinances on agri reforms and a third one in the pipeline. These are largely because the 15th Finance Commission has also put a condition that the states will receive grants because of this. Now, can a statutory body impose legislative measures to receive grants? Is this constitutionally legitimate?
Okay, so I think now Prabhat will have the floor. Yeah. Thank you, Srijit. Yeah. Yes, so Prabhat, floor is yours.
Probably Professor Patnaik has been disconnected.
No, so he has to unmute. Prabhat, can you unmute, please?
He's disconnected, sir.
Did he?
Disconnected.
Not deliberately. It has happened
by mistake or
by mistake. So would you please, somebody who is an expert, Amarendra, can you please help Prabhat connect up?
Okay, let me call him and ask.
Ask him. Yeah. That's unfortunate, but let's see. Are you getting Prabhat? Shall I? Amarendra, are you there? Amarendra?
I think he must be in touch. You can
Yes, Professor Prabhat Patnaik is connecting. Actually, by mistake, there is some network issue, so he got disconnected, but he is connecting back.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Meanwhile, just for the information of the audience, I should tell that Professor Prabhat Patnaik was the president of Odisha Economics Association in the year 1980, and that year the conference was held at GM College, Sambalpur.
Yes. 1980.
Yes.
So he must have been a young president then.
Yes, because I think he became professor in 1983. So before that, he was already the president of the association.
Yes.
Yes.
He's born in the 19. You probably know this, Amarendra. Since you looked at Google perhaps to get all the details. So his year of birth would be there. So in 1980, he would have been less than 40. Less than 40.
Yes. Yeah.
He would have been less than 40.
Uh, yes.
36.
Yeah. In fact, he is born in 1945. So yes.
35.
Yes.
35.
Yes. 35 years old.
Yes. And as presidents of the Odisha Economic Association, that might be the lowest age, perhaps. I don't know of any other person who is younger. The first president was Sadasiva Babu. He must have been in his, I would say, 50s, perhaps, when he became president. Am I right about this? The first president is Sadasiva Babu.
Yes. Yes. I think Jagannath sir would be able to give all these details.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, no, Sadasiv Mishra was the first president of the association, and the second president was Professor Devendra Chandra Mishra, and third was Professor Vidyadhar Mishra, and fourth is Professor Badanath Mishra.
Yes, yes. I think they would all have been in their 40s or 50s, more like 50s.
Yes.
କିଛି difficult ହଉଛି ବୋଧେ ସେ କରିପାରୁନାହାନ୍ତି. Now it's just 6 o'clock. Just see if we can get back. It has been a fantastic lecture. So friends, even if we are not able to get him back on to answering these questions.
Amarendra, I hope he's not having problem with getting in.
Let me again ask him. Let me ask him again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just check. If he can come in, very good. We'll listen to him, and then we'll close the meeting out.
No, because there is a problem of people logging in and getting into the conference room now, because some people are sending messages. So I hope that he's also not facing this problem.
Rajesh is talking about a very yes, and already Bortaman to 77 people are there. 77 people. It's a big number. So did you speak to him, Amarendra, on telephone? Amarendra? Amarendra, can you hear me? No.
Sir, probably he is talking to him.
He is talking to him. Acha, ठीक ଅଛି. ମୋ ପାଖେ ବି ଅଛି ପ୍ରଭାତ ବାବୁଙ୍କ number କିନ୍ତୁ ମୁଁ କରୁନି because Amarendra is talking to him, so that's fine. Not a problem.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Okay, so now Professor Patnaik will be answering the questions over phone since there is some network issue. Is it audible now?
Yes,
Hello.
we can hear.
Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes, Prabhat, continue,
Hello.
please. Please answer
Can
the
you
question.
hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please, sir. Go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
sir.
Okay. You see, five or six questions were asked to me, and I could catch only the first three. After that, somehow I could. So let me answer those. First
Sure.
question was, what is the role of the private sector in the pandemic? Now, you see, the private sector itself does not directly have any role in the pandemic, because the pandemic is something which has to be managed by the state, by the government. So the private sector, I mean, obviously there are private hospitals, private testing facilities, private medical facilities. Now, one of the things that happens in India, you see, in Spain, they actually nationalized temporarily all the private medical facilities in order that people can actually test free and can be treated free. But in India, that we have not done. We have only put a cap of 17,000 per day or some such thing on the treatment. But on the other hand, we have private medical facilities continuing to treat patients and treat them for a price. Now, the rest of the private sector does not really have any role in the pandemic. Okay, so that is the first question. The second question is, austerity meant to reduce unemployment? No, you see, the problem with the current crisis in India is that it's a crisis of insufficient demand, and unemployment is because of insufficient demand. Therefore, austerity at this time would actually aggravate the problem of insufficient demand. If necessary, the government should actually enlarge the fiscal deficit. Many economists are talking about the need for the government to enlarge the fiscal deficit. To my way of thinking, rather than enlarging the fiscal deficit, it is better if we have government expenditure financed by wealth taxation. Because fiscal deficit is not going to be inflationary. We have plenty of food grain stocks. We have plenty of unutilized capacity. Therefore, it's not going to be inflationary. But what it will do is that it will actually increase wealth inequality in society, because every time the government has a fiscal deficit, you see, it is actually generating an excess of savings over investment in private hands in order to finance the excess of investment over savings in government hands, which is the fiscal deficit. Okay, that is why it is better to take away that excess wealth from private sector, and that is something which, therefore, I do not believe that austerity is required. I believe what is required is larger government expenditure financed through wealth taxation. The third question which Rajesh raised was the question of hunger deaths, starvation deaths. Now, you see, the point is that if you look at the amount of food grain stocks in the economy, that is plentiful. Now, it is true that is not available in Odisha, but on the other hand, the Food Corporation of India has plenty of food grain stocks, and as long as the center makes food grain stocks available to Odisha, there is no reason why there should be starvation death, provided, of course, and now in any case there is, free food grain is going to be distributed, at least that is the slogan, to a large number of people, and so there should not be starvation death. If there is starvation death, then that is symptomatic of some flaw in the functioning of the system. It's not as if we have any shortage of food grains in the country, or it's not even at this moment that we have a shortage of purchasing power, because food grains are supposed to be distributed free. So if there is starvation death, that means food grains are not being distributed free, or food grains are not available in the ration shops if they're available in the country. Okay, so these are the three questions I got. The other two I couldn't quite catch. Can you tell me what they were? One of them was your own question, I think. Yeah.
No, sir. Professor Srijit Mishra was asking the question that can states be independently allowed to raise revenue?
Given the states?
Yes.
Yes, I you see, one of the things which has actually happened, you see, direct taxes were always raised by the center. Okay. Indirect taxes were raised by the states, particularly the sales tax. The sales tax actually provided as much as 80% of the total revenue of the state. It was the backbone of state finances. Now, of course, there cannot be any sales tax or any such thing because of the GST. The argument was put forward that you have to have a common market for which you have a common taxation, tax rate. Therefore, there was a CGST rate and GST rate which was supposed to be common, and that was supposed to be decided by the GST Council. Now, this is an absurd argument because the United States, which is the most important capitalist country in the world, it does not have a GST. Every state has its own taxation system, as was the case in India before, and nobody can say that the US doesn't have a national market. So on the basis of this argument, which is quite a spurious one, you had the states surrendering their rights to raise even the indirect taxes which were constitutionally provided to them. And therefore, I agree with the fact that they have to recapture fiscal space, but on the other hand, that would mean going against the policy trend of the last several years.
Sir, another question is, what should be the role of the small and medium scale enterprises in India to strengthen the rural economy in post-COVID era?
Yes, I think that's very important because I'm talking about an increase in the home market, and if the stimulus for the increase in the home market is going to come from agricultural growth, it would generate incomes in the hands of the peasants, and these incomes they are going to spend on all kinds of small, kind of simple consumer goods which are best produced by the rural enterprises. As a matter of fact, I believe that actually a good way of helping rural enterprises at this moment is for the government to include work in rural enterprises of a certain size as part of the MGNREGS. You see, in the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, certain kinds of work are allowed. In other words, workers enrolling in the scheme go and work those kinds of work, but on the other hand, their salary is paid from within the scheme, which means by the government. I think one way of subsidizing rural enterprises would be to say that at least for the next 6 months or for the next 1 year, until these enterprises have established themselves, let the wage bill of these enterprises be paid from the MDNREGS, which is actually, which means from the government. So I believe rural enterprises are very important. Demand for rural enterprises goods would be increasing in the near future, particularly if agricultural growth picks up. And if that happens, the government can actually sustain rural enterprises by subsidizing their wage bill.
Sir, there's another question.
Amrendra, please. I think now,
Sir,
the time is 10 minutes past.
we should end.
I think it's 10 minutes past 6. We were thinking going till 6.
One is, what should be the role of the government towards migrants in post-pandemic?
The role of the government in
For migrant workers.
No, you see, the point is that it turns out that in India there are actually altogether 14 crore migrant workers, of whom about 10 crore are interstate migrants. In other words, they work in other states and so on, which is an enormously large figure. Even the finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman said there are 8 crore interstate migrant workers, but private estimates put it at 10 crores. Now, the point is that you see, if in India, the lockdown was imposed at 4 hours notice. Now, when you impose a lockdown, immediately large numbers of migrant workers are deprived of their income. Now, they were not given any compensation. There was no money that was given. In fact, many economists have been demanding, many economists, Abhijit Banerjee, many economists have been demanding, all of us have been demanding that look, you give them 7,500 rupees or 7,000 rupees per month, okay, to every migrant, or to every household, which would cover the migrant household as well, because after all, you need to make some money available. If there's a lockdown, people can't work, then it's not just they also require to buy all kinds of other things, oil, salt, this, that, and the other. So for that, you actually make something available to them, and we have been demanding that it should be 7,000, some people are saying 7,500 rupees per household that should be made available to the workers. Now, no such thing was announced, and it still has not been done to this day. So if it is the case that you don't give any compensation and you close down, their income sources are completely cut off. They can't even pay their rent. The landlord throws them out. Therefore, they are out of the streets. And that defeats the whole purpose of the lockdown. Therefore, in India, we handle the issue of the migrant workers in an extremely ham-handed way. Now, what the government has done is that, many of them who are going to their villages have been allowed to get to their villages and so on, and therefore that phase is over. Now the problem is that many of them, now that the lockdown is slowly getting lifted, they will demand to get the migrant workers back. But someone who is trekked to his village all the way is not going to come back that easily. And what is more, there is something unfair about forcing such a person to come back to the village. So I think it is very important to enlarge employment opportunities in rural areas themselves, and this can be done in two ways. One, of course, is, as I discussed earlier, rural enterprises for which the government should actually subsidize the wage bill, and the other is MGNREGS itself. MGNREGS should be expanded to cover rural enterprises, and MGNREGS should be expanded in order to cover other kinds of work as well, including work in agriculture. So there has to be an enormous increase in the scope of MGNREGS, which is now the main lifeline for large numbers of workers who have actually returned to their villages.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. I think we will stop here taking questions. And since you are not on the Google Meet over phone, I would like to thank you. And on behalf of the Odisha Economics Association, we would like to extend hearty vote of thanks, because
my laptop you will be able to join in just a moment. So you can be challenged for the last 5-10 minutes. So I'm really sorry that I could not really meet face to face,
No problems.
I'm sorry about that.
No problems.
No issue, sir. No issue,
We
sir.
heard your speech perfectly.
Okay, goodbye.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir. Namaste.
Okay, bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Prabhat. So Amarendra, yes, please. Continue. Amarendra, you were saying something. So let me from my side also thank everyone. I think, friends, this has been a wonderful opportunity to hear our very best intellectual force among the economists. He happens to be from Odisha, and he continues to be active, thinking about issues, and almost always he raises the right kind of issues that are relevant for us. Quite unlike a whole lot of other economists who are well trained, oftentimes Western trained, but they are with totally different kinds of concerns. But Prabhat, through his 50-year-old commitment to this particular subject, he continues to look at the problems with the right kind of emphasis, looking at the bottom sections of the population, and looks at the economic issues in the right kind of manner that we want economists to be grappling with the kind of issues that we really have before us. So on behalf of all of us, I want to thank Prabhat also. But I hand over to Amarendra if you want to say anything and you want to conclude. And Bhavesh Babu, if you want to conclude, it's all yours. Thank you.
Yeah, I would request Professor Harrison, the president of the association, to speak something. And yeah.
It's more than what the time we had earlier announced. So it was a very nice talk, and it has been very useful to all of us. And the 5 points which he has prescribed are really very thought-provoking, and I think it will take us in the right direction if we can implement that. But it is the political will to do that. We don't know how much they will be able to do that, about that wealth tax and other inheritance tax. Okay, so those things we have to say, depend on the politicians, the government, the policymakers. Let's see. And so it was a very nice talk that we heard, and I thank all of the people present here. And my special thanks to Professor Prabhat Patnaik and Professor Pulin Naik, who has taken the pain to be present and giving their valuable time. So with that, I conclude. If Amarendra, you have anything to say, then, or we conclude here.
Yes, sir. I think we should conclude. And I would again thank Professor Pulin Naik and Professor Prabhat Patnaik and all the audience who could join. And I am extremely sorry that I am hearing that so many people are trying to join the meeting, but they could not. I do not know why, because at least 250 people could join, but some 105, 106 people only could join. But anyway, since now this video is available on the YouTube, they can watch this. Yeah. So thank you so much. I think with this we shall conclude.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Would you enter class?